So, let's talk about Han King's The Vegetarian. Get ready to dive in with me as we discuss the 3 parts of the novella, the questionable characters, as well as some of the unique themes. Obviously, spoiler alert for the content discussed in this video. So, right away when getting started talking about the novella, I just want to put up a few trigger warnings for the following themes. Now, the novel itself came out in 2007 and was originally published in Korean, so the notion of trigger warnings hadn't really come about yet. However, it is now 2023, and the book does deal with some very heavy topics, so I think it is necessary when diving into the content. Personally, I do wish that I had at least a little bit of background knowledge when it came to the themes discussed in the book, such as like the graphic descriptions of sexual abuse or the graphic depictions of what happens to an emaciated human body. It was just a little unsettling, and the synopsis that the book gives you that you kind of look up on Wikipedia or that the back of the book will tell you, it is very surfacey. It does not at all prepare you for the horrors that you're about to read, and I do think that this book can be kind of classified as the horror genre. It's unsettling, to say the least. It is definitely a little bit creepy and a little bit science fiction, maybe? Okay, without further ado, let's get into discussing this work of literature. We'll kick off this review with a brief synopsis. The Vegetarian is of course divided into 3 parts, with the part 1 itself being called The Vegetarian. This part is told from the point of view from our protagonist, Young Hae, her husband, Mr. Chong. Now, Mr. Chong is an absolutely horrible person. Like, think of the worst man you know and multiply it by 10. He pretty much views his wife as a maid and a bed companion, not at all like his equal or his partner like you should in a marriage. He just basically wants her to cook, clean, and do her due diligence as a wife. We see from page 1 that he is not a likable character, and as the story goes on, it becomes even clearer how big a piece of crap that he really is. But basically, he tells the reader about how his and his wife's life is nothing extraordinary until one day, Young Hae begins having dreams that cause her to give up all meat and eventually all animal byproducts, but the word vegan's never mentioned in the story. In the society that the book takes place in, not eating meat and being a vegetarian or a vegan is extremely taboo. Everyone around Young Hae takes high offense when she refuses to eat, like her sister, her father, her husband, especially her father and her husband. They treat the word vegetarian almost as if it's a slur. Like, it is a really bad thing in this book to be a vegetarian. It's really weird. The part goes on, and the reader begins to realize that Young Hae is kind of having a mental breakdown, and her family goes as far as to physically assault her, leading to her self-harming, and she has to end up spending some time in the psychiatric ward of a hospital. When the part ends, we're left with the assumption that Mr. Chong is going to leave his wife over her mental breakdown, her not eating meat, her not doing her due diligence as a wife, that sort of stuff. Part 2 is where the weirdness really kicks into gear. It's called Mongolian Mark and is told from the point of view of Young Hae's brother-in-law. It also switches at this time from first person to third person point of view, which can be a bit confusing at first. I had to look up on Google while I was reading whose point of view the new story was in. I don't know how long it would have taken me to realize had I not looked it up. If you're like me and have never heard of a Mongolian mark before reading the story, it's just a congenital birthmark, usually over the lumbosacral area. It's usually found on infants and typically disappears within age. But in this part, Young Hae's brother-in-law learns that Young Hae's Mongolian mark never disappeared, and this sexually arouses him, which is very gross, one, because Mongolian marks are typically found on children, and just weird too, because why would the premise of a birthmark sexually arouse someone? That's kind of something it's never really answered. It's just, you kind of gotta understand and assume that this he's just a little bit of a freak, and he does acknowledge in the part that he's a freak, and it's almost like he hates himself for these feelings, but he can't help it, and he acts on them anyway. It just leads to him obsessing and fantasizing over her, which of course is problematic in any relationship, but especially this one because Young Hae is unwell, and she is not in the right state of mind to consent to anything that could possibly happen. And unfortunately, her brother-in-law does end up taking advantage of her, and his wife, Young Hai's sister, discovers this and immediately divorces him, and she gets her sister back in a psychiatric ward. Side note, Young Hai's sister is a saint. Her name is In Hai. The amount of stuff that she goes through in this book is unreal, and it's like she just never gives up. From a reader's point of view, we know that Young Hai is not well enough to have full control over her actions. We know that as the reader. But trying to think of In Hai, who's in the situation, it's surprising that she does not shun her sister and that she goes straight to getting her sister the help that she needs, and that she continues to visit her sister. We end up seeing this in part 3, which is called The Flaming Trees. It's told from the point of view of Young Hai's saint of a sister, and it stays in the third person. This is the part that we really get to see the extent of the damage Young Hai has done to her body due to her disordered eating and being a vegetarian or a vegan. She believes that she just needs to be watered. She doesn't need food, she just needs water. She wants to be a tree. And the whole part is essentially just her sisters and her doctor's struggle to feed her, because she's refusing food, struggling too much for IVs, and refusing feeding tubes. The ending is left slightly open-ended, and the reader's not quite sure of what Young Hai's fate will end up being. I think that's part of the beauty of the book. You have to decide, or you get to decide. Okay, so now that we've covered the whole basic plot line, let's get into the content rating. I tried to look the book up on ratedreads.com and found out that it was not on there. So I figured I would just use their system and assign it a rating myself. Rating Reads goes on a scale of green to red, or none, no content warnings, to a high amount of content warnings. It should be very obvious based on the trigger warnings that I assigned earlier in the video that this novella earns itself an extremely red rating. The details are honestly too graphic for even a high schooler to read, I think. I mean, not to say that they can't. What they do in their free time is up to them, but it definitely should not at all be discussed in a high school classroom setting, or assigned as a high school reading at all. If this were a movie, I would go as far to say that it's rated X, with just the amount of graphic sexual depictions alone, along with the psychological horror that goes into this. There's several scenes of, like, when we're talking about Young Hai's dreams of the animals, it's just kind of revolting, honestly. She does have this one dream about a dog that is just running and running until it can't go anymore. It made me feel physically ill as I was reading it, and I had to put the book down for a few minutes and just take a breather because it was starting to affect my mental health, which is also something you should be careful of if you have a history of disordered eating or depression or self-harm, anything like that. I do think that this book can put you back into that place while you're reading it. It definitely messed with my mental health a little bit as I was reading, and I had to take several breaks and kind of just remind myself it's a book and I shouldn't let the main character's feelings become my own, which I am bad about doing in any book, not just bad ones, but good ones too. I tend to let the media that I consume dictate how I'm feeling for the day or the week or however long it takes me to read. Getting on to the themes of the book, this one, it's really hard to decide, honestly. I struggled for a while thinking about it, but ultimately, I think I'm gonna land on that the themes are men suck. Okay, not really, but you kind of get the point with the depictions of Young Hai's husband and her brother-in-law and how they just are constantly abusing and taking advantage of her. I do think that the theme it was trying to make is kind of how men in the society that the book takes place in are just they're placed on a pedestal and the woman is just supposed to obey. A lot of the stuff that happens is because they treat her so horrible for not wanting to eat meat, when in reality it's not a huge deal. It's not like she's not cooking for her husband or refusing anybody else. She is making vegan and vegetarian dishes, but it is not enough for the people that surround her. And because of this, her father physically assaults her, her husband sexually assaults her, her brother-in-law takes advantage of her when she's in a fragile state of mind, And it is all just very telling that the one sane person in the book is a woman, Young Hai's sister. She is the only one to show true compassion for her sister. She even takes blame at being her older sister, feeling like somehow she was responsible for Young Hai's mental breakdown. And obviously the reader knows that's not the case, but looking at it as if we were in her spot, you can understand how she would feel maybe a little guilty for everything that's gone on with her sister. A big thing with the men in the story is kind of the fact that they just ignore the real problem. Young Hai's husband doesn't really acknowledge the fact that Young Hai's struggling. She is refusing to eat. She's growing skinny. He says she's growing so skinny that she almost has the body of a child. And that's not really what concerns him. He does make a note of it, but that's not his main priority. His main priority isn't that my wife is super unhealthy and is obsessing about food in an unhealthy manner. It's more like my wife is not making me food. Not that she's not making me food. She's not making me the food that I want to eat. I want meat and she's not giving me meat. I'm gonna call her parents and I'm gonna complain about how crazy she is for disobeying me and not making me any meat. That's his main problem. Later on in part 1, they kind of go to like a family get together, and it's almost like an intervention. Like they're having a huge intervention for her to try and get her some meat. They're like trying to force feed her. And her dad's main priority with her is not the fact that she looks sick, not the fact that she's actively refusing to talk or speak and like is showing real signs of like mental instability when it comes to discussing me. It's the fact that she's disobeying her father, she's disobeying her husband, and that's not what a woman should do, not to them. So it's like they're all brushing over the real problem, which is Young Hai's mental health. And I think why the novel does this goes back to its title, The Vegetarian. Overall, the whole prospect of being a vegetarian is really discussed very little in the book. Like, yes, she refuses to eat meat and that's where these problems begin, but it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the actual thought of being a vegetarian. Which I think is kind of like it's a distraction. The title kind of acts as a distraction. The whole time I was reading, I kept thinking like, okay, there's something else is gonna happen. There's more to being a vegetarian than just this chain of events that started with the vegetarian. But I kind of think that's what the title wanted to do. It wanted to provide as a distraction to the reader. It kind of puts yourself in Young Hai's place. Like, they were all ignoring the real problem, her being mentally unwell, whether she realized that or not. While we're reading, the title ignores what the book is really about. It's about how women are taken advantage of, how they're abused, how they're expected to be raised by their husbands, basically. And not at all about the fact that this woman is suffering so bad that she's destroying her body, that she's self-harming, that she's doesn't really have any sanity left by the end of it. Ultimately, the novel can also be kind of watered down to breaking societal expectations. The book takes place in a deeply patriarchal society, and the people in this society, they just want the norm to be followed. They don't want people to challenge what they view as normal. And when you do, like Young Hai does, all she does is stop eating meat. And this has such severe ramifications from the people and the community she's around that I think it's part of what takes such a toll on her mentally. I do think that whatever problems she has going on in her head are so severe that it would have happened regardless of whether or not her family supported her being a vegetarian. But I think that the extent it got to and how fast it happened is a direct result of having no support from her family or husband, and really just being ridiculed and treated as an outcast, or like she's doing something horribly wrong. They really treat her like a criminal for not eating meat. She ends up becoming ostracized by the society, by her husband, by her parents. Her sister tries, but she kind of ostracizes herself in a way from her sister. They don't know how to talk to each other. And in the end, it does seem that she ends up being destroyed by this society that wants her to conform to what they think is normal. And I kind of think that's what the author was trying to call out. Yes, this type of stuff is not seen to the extreme that it is in the book, but in the author's country, it's really normal to just have patriarchal practice that the man is the head of the house. The wife needs to obey the husband. The wife needs to provide. The wife shouldn't really have a life outside of their family, and if they choose to, family still needs to be number one. That's how Young Hai's brother-in-law justifies cheating on his wife with his sister-in-law. And speaking of the brother-in-law, he is another one that is attempting to break societal norms. Although, not to defend him in any way, because he is also a horrible person. He's definitely worse than Young Hai's husband. But he wants to break societal norms through his art. He longs to create something that challenges society. And I guess to give him credit where credit is due, he definitely does that in a horrible, assaulty way. And to get on talking about it, there are a lot of parallels between Young Hai and her brother-in-law. Both of them have suicide scares, for example. It's like they both see no way out when things get a little tough. Going forward, as In Hai tries to continue caring for her sister, it's pretty evident that her life is crumbling around her as well. She's going against what is the norm. She divorces her husband in favor of Young Hai. She estranges herself from her parents because she wants to help Young Hai while her parents just want to leave her to rot, basically. All of these characters who go against societal norms and kind of do, whether or not they're doing the right thing, like In Hai, whether or not they're doing the wrong thing, like In Hai's husband, whether or not they're doing something that has no repercussions on anybody but themselves, like Young Hai, it is not okay. It's always going to be a problem for somebody. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you're on good or evil side. It doesn't matter if you're on no one's side. If you are not following the societal expectations, you will be ostracized, you will be trapped, you will be isolated, until eventually your life falls apart. And I think that's a lot what the author was trying to point out, and kind of trying to use the vegetarian as a cautionary tale. So to end things and keep it kind of short, the book is unlike anything you have or will ever read before. It's a shock. Nothing can quite prepare you for what it is you're about to read. I think you just have to read it. And I think that's intentional. I think that the title is misleading for a reason. I think that the synopsis provided by the author is very underwhelming. It's just not a good gauge of what to expect when you're about to dive into reading this book. Is that a good or bad thing? I don't know. From a literary standpoint, I think it's a good thing. I think it's amazing to have such a shocking turn of events. I mean, I think that's kind of rare to read these days. From a personal standpoint, I don't know. I do wish I knew more of what I was about to encounter before I read the book. But, I mean, that's my own ignorance. I could have spoiled it for myself. I could have. I just didn't. So, I don't know. I'll leave that up to you as you read the book. Hopefully you like it. Personally, while I see the vision and I see why some people love it, and I see why it's so important from a literary standpoint, I still did not enjoy the book. And I think that's okay. I think you can recognize that something has good writing and that is a good work of art or literature while still not personally enjoying that. I think that's an okay thing to do. So yeah, I hope this helped a little bit. If it didn't, this was my video synopsis / review / rating, and yeah, I'm out.